On today's episode of Field Frequency, I sit down with Dan Wilson, Vice President of Energy Solutions at Inspiration Mobility. We unpack what fleet electrification actually looks like on the ground. Not the headlines, but the operational and economic reality. We get into roaming networks, AI, and charger diagnostics, and why the biggest constraint to EV adoption isn't hardware or policy, it's human inertia inside fleet operations. If you operate fleets, infrastructure, energy assets, then this is a practical conversation about how electrification gets deployed. Let's tune in. Welcome to another episode of Field Frequency, powered by Field Advantage, an IT field services company specializing in the deployment, maintenance, and operation of critical infrastructure, including EV charging networks. Today, I'm happy to have Dan Wilson, Vice President of Energy Solutions at Inspiration Mobility. Hi, Dan.
Hey, great to be here, Jason. Thanks for having me. I just want to say I've listened to every single previous episode. I think you've done a great job bringing on a lot of different industry leaders, and I learned something from every single episode I listened to, and really honored to be here with you and to join that illustrious group.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thanks for doing your homework. I don't know that everyone does their homework, but I appreciate you taking time to listen to the episodes and really connect with what Field Frequency is doing in the space. Just trying to create thought leadership platform and bring on subject matter experts like yourself, folks that are out there in the trenches making this EV thing happen. So appreciate you being a part of this and also for listening too.
Yeah. Of course.
So let's get started. I want to get kind of going on your background first. Obviously, we want to get a walk through your personal origin story and what led up, what experiences led up to your role at Inspiration Mobility. And then also just talk to us about who Inspiration Mobility is as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Happy to do that. So in terms of my story, when I was toward the end of college, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, honestly. So I was kind of searching around, trying to figure out what my next step was. I actually took a year off after college, and during that time got really passionate about sustainability, clean energy, electric mobility, all those things. And so I ended up going back to grad school at University of Michigan to pursue the kind of that field, and had a really great experience there, getting a dual master's degree from University of Michigan in both sustainability and kind of energy systems engineering. And that led to a lot of great job opportunities. So I ended up joining a company called Black & Veatch. It's a pretty well-known engineering construction company in the infrastructure world. And I was a renewable energy consultant there for a number of years, working on grid integration and kind of mostly large-scale wind and solar projects and renewable energy technologies. And then toward the end of my time there, I migrated more toward focusing on distributed energy resource technologies like rooftop solar and battery storage and EV charging, among others. And also during that time while I was at Black & Veatch, I got my first EV, which was a first-gen Nissan Leaf. And I know from previous episodes, you were also a Nissan Leaf driver. So you could sympathize with, the limitations of that model, but also it was a really cool car. And I loved that thing. It was great. It had like 80 or 90 miles of range, but I didn't care. It was awesome. I just loved the electric driving experience. And then I'm now on my fourth EV. Since then, that was 2014 when I got my first Leaf. So we're now 12 years later, and I've got a Rivian R1S now. It's my fourth EV, and love it. It's the best car I've ever had. So really, just am amazed to see the kind of the progress and the evolution of the technology, right, in that time in terms of the vehicle side. But coming back to my background, so because of my time at Black & Veatch, I had this kind of deep knowledge in kind of the utility and energy infrastructure space, as well as distributed energy resources. I was recruited by a startup called Change Energy here in the LA area in Southern California that was focused on selling medium-duty electric delivery vans to FedEx and other last-mile delivery fleets. So I was on that team for several years. We worked with FedEx, was our big kind of marquee customer, where we deployed a lot of charging infrastructure at their fleet depots all over the state of California, from San Diego up to Sacramento. We did 21 sites, 614 DC charging ports actually at their sites. So it was kind of an interesting technology where we actually put the chargers overhead inside this indoor depot where they would park at the loading dock to load their vehicles. So that was a really interesting experience. Honestly, learned a ton. And unfortunately, that company, Change Energy, went out of business, lack of funding. So I know that a lot of people in this space like me have gone through that experience of either going through instability. If you haven't been through that experience, you probably haven't been in this industry very long, I guess is what I've found. But anyway, it was a painful experience at the time, but led to something really great because I got introduced by a mutual friend to Josh Green, who's the founder and CEO of Inspiration Mobility, where I am now. I really hit it off with him and really resonated with his vision of starting a company that was sort of both a vehicle and charger agnostic solution provider and financier for fleet electrification and all the assets related to fleet electrification. So I joined as a very early employee. I was tied for number 5 on the team, and I was the first member of the team that was focused on charging specifically. So I kind of started our charging business basically from scratch, which was really fun and interesting. And today I am really focused on leading the deployment of all of our kind of charging solutions that are especially more on the fleet depot, larger fast charging hub kind of side of things. Generally our subject matter expert when it comes to hardware and software in the charging space, all those sorts of things. So I've really been enjoying my time at Inspiration. And then just to give a little bit more background on what Inspiration does. So Inspiration Mobility Group is the first fleet management company that really combines an energy infrastructure business with fleet management, right? And kind of putting those pieces together to make it much easier for fleets to adopt EVs. So the idea is that we're a one-stop shop supporting commercial fleets from along every part of the electrification journey, right? From initial basic education through planning the EV transition, procuring vehicles, financing and leasing those vehicles to the fleet, providing on-road fleet management services, things like managed maintenance, tolls and violations, roadside assistance, fuel cards, all that kind of stuff. And then also going in and providing the charging services right alongside that to make it as easy and kind of seamless and cost effective as possible for fleets to electrify. So you can think of Inspiration primarily as a company that is doing financing and fleet management, right? In this space. And basically all those other services that we provide is really kind of just reducing the barriers and figuring out how do we deploy more EVs faster here in the United States. So in terms of what we do with customers, just one type of customer that we've been really focused on lately is large corporate fleets. And with those, they often have sustainability goals. And so we help them think through like, okay, how can EV deployment really help you meet your sustainability goals? But we also always really highlight the fact that not only is it a sustainability win when you deploy EVs, if you do it right, and if you have the right partners to do it correctly, then you should save a lot of money, right? On an ongoing basis, right? By switching. So we think any company that has, any fleet of any size should really be looking at electrification seriously because there are a lot of use cases today where it makes a ton of sense economically, as well as from an environmental perspective. So, and then just quickly on the charging side of the business, in terms of what we do there, we're really, really flexible in what types of charging solutions we deliver, how we deliver them to the customer. So think of, we can be anything from just an advisor to help them kind of do initial planning. We can be a general contractor to build some charging infrastructure for them, or we can be a complete charging as a service turnkey provider where they literally just pay by the kilowatt hour. And we can be the developer, owner, operator of the infrastructure. So very flexible there. So instead of really selling like a specific product, like, we're not selling a specific hardware product or a specific software product, or even a specific, service, right? Like engineering service. We're really selling an outcome. We will help you as a fleet figure out what is the right set of charging solutions or optimal mix of charging solutions to make it, again, as like seamless, as easy, and as cost effective as possible to bring EVs into your fleet. And we really find that if you're a fleet of any size, you're probably going to need a mix of charging solutions to really get to the best outcome in terms of EV adoption, because there's so many different factors, different use cases, different vehicle types, different locations, right, that fleets need to deal with that often lead to, you need to kind of mix and match a lot of different things.
Yeah. Well, that's a robust solution. And I like the way you framed that you're selling an outcome, not necessarily just a product. So that's got to take a lot of probably ingesting of the customer needs and probably a calibration of what they think their needs are, because as the subject matter experts, you're coming in and it's not just a widget. This is an outcome. And I think that's a powerful phrasing. The way you've phrased that is an outcome. So when you're talking to corporate fleets, there's obviously that's just like a Pandora's box, I would think of, in terms of who those customers are. And so there's got to be different fleet charging solutions that meet the different and varied needs of these corporate fleet customers. And so in that co-creation with them based on their needs, what are those different fleet charging solutions that Inspiration Mobility offers?
Yeah, and it's a pretty wide mix. So yeah, we happy to talk more about that. Like I said, when we're working with, a fleet of really any size, right? Whether it's hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of vehicles, which we work with fleets literally just about any size you can think of all over the country. We really need, yeah, it's really a mix, and it's everything from a single charger at home up to a very large, depot, right? With tens or hundreds of chargers potentially right at a single location. But specifically, we think about really six different types of charging solutions, six different categories that we usually talk about with our fleet customers, and think about how do we, again, mix and match for each fleet. So first one being, when people think of fleets, often they think of, vehicles that come back to a depot, right? And park overnight. And so putting on-site depot charging, which is often, level 2 AC chargers for overnight, kind of slow charging. That's, often a default solution that a lot of fleets think of, a lot of people think of when they, envision fleet charging. But really that's just one piece of the puzzle. So there's, in addition to depot charging, there's also home charging. I think a lot of people are surprised about the proportion of fleet vehicles in this country that actually go home with the drivers every night.
Yes.
And that's everything from sedans that are used by sales reps up to pretty large vans and trucks that are like work trucks or service vans, right, that are taken home by the drivers. So often, there's a great solution, which is often just put in a level 2 AC charger at the driver's home, right? If that's feasible, right? If they own their home, right? If they get the right approvals from their landlord, et cetera, then that can be a great solution, right? If you charge while you're sleeping, that's pretty much the best way to go. Also, most people will probably be familiar with public charging as another option, right? And we usually recommend that as more of a backup option for fleets, but it can be part of the solution, right? And obviously is kind of the quickest and easiest way to get started. If they, have a small number of vehicles and they know there's, good public charging available in a given area, then that can be a perfectly reasonable solution, again, for a certain type of use case. It's usually, DC fast chargers, right, that we're talking about for public charging. Fourth category we think about is mobile and temporary charging, which I think there's been a lot of talk about that in the last few years. Certainly, we think that can often be not the ideal solution for the long term, right, because it can be kind of expensive. But it can be a great kind of bridge solution, right, until you get to a kind of a more permanent on-site depot charging solution or home charging solution. It can also be a good solution for backup and resilience, right, for on-site charging as well in some cases. So we, certainly familiar with all the many vendors that are providing those types of services now, and that's everything from putting a big battery on a trailer, right, and attaching it to some chargers, and having that battery, fed from a building, grid connection. Could be a battery that's taken off site and charged off site and then brought back and then, dispenses energy to the vehicles. Or it can be an on-site set of chargers that are fed by some kind of either generator, which is, fed by diesel, natural gas, propane, some kind of liquid fuel. And so that's a pretty wide range of those solutions out in the market today. But we think that, again, can be part of the solution. Then the fifth category we think about is called park and charge, which I think might be a new concept to a lot of people. And I can actually talk about this a little bit because I know you recently had Kieran from Curo, the company Curo. Kieran is the CEO on the show, and again, really enjoyed that episode, among others. And so we work closely with Curo basically to provide this park and charge service, which is essentially you have a lot of existing level 2 chargers that are out there in the world at office buildings, corporate campuses, healthcare facilities, hotels, et cetera, that are often underutilized today. And so you can basically have a fleet customer sign a contract and basically reserve that charging stall. It could be overnight or during the day, depends on their needs, and basically give them this dedicated charging stall that they don't have to pay for all the capex up front, right? They just pay on an ongoing kind of monthly payment. So I think that's a pretty interesting solution and has been helpful for some of our fleet customers already today. And then the sixth category I'll mention is multi-fleet hub charging, where we are looking at a larger project that's got a number of DC fast chargers on a site that is serving usually multiple fleets, kind of sharing the infrastructure, but it's kind of fleet dedicated. So it's different than public charging, right? Public charging, generally light duty passenger vehicles, right? Kind of anybody can pull up. These multi-fleet charging hubs are generally built specifically to serve fleets. And so that's another important solution that we have actually developed some of those kind of sites ourselves as well. So those are the 6 types. Like I said, it's really one of the big jobs that I have, and our team as an inspiration is helping fleet customers sort through those 6 different options,
Yeah.
every
Yeah.
different vehicle, every different
Yeah.
location in their fleet, right, to figure out like
Mhm.
what is the right mix.
Yeah. You know, that's fantastic, and thanks for that robust overview of Inspiration Mobility's solutions. And so, for those fleet managers that are listening, for those fleet operators that are listening, you need to call Dan at Inspiration Mobility to let them help you with your electrification plans. And I appreciate that. I appreciate the solution that you're working on, because in a previous life I was a fleet manager, and so I understand all the needs. And so when a fleet is looking at the integration of an alternative energy powered vehicle, it changes everything. It changes everything from maintenance to fueling, on-site fueling, to everything, staging, technician training, parking. I mean,
Yeah.
it just impacts. And so, like you said earlier, it's driving towards an intended outcome, and there's a lot behind unpacking what gets us to where we need to be in terms of a fleet solution. So that's great, Dan. Thank you for sharing all that. I would like to get into maybe some policy and headwind conversation with you. And the reason is Inspiration Mobility has engaged Capitol Hill, providing guidance on legislation in the past, and um, has been involved in helping kind of frame up, in terms of a legislative perspective, real world EV deployments. Are you able to talk about what Inspiration Mobility has done in that sense, and share some of that experience, and maybe, well, we might talk about policy changes here in a minute, but yeah, can you share some on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have been very engaged, just as a quick summary, in policy, especially over the last 12 months, right? As you can imagine,
Hmm.
with the new administration coming in,
Hmm.
a lot of big changes in terms of policy and incentives. So I'll go back to just about a year ago now. We, as a company, we joined with a bunch of other companies in the fleet electrification space, and formed a lobbying group called the American Fleet Leadership Coalition, which was specifically formed a year ago to lobby for keeping the 45W commercial vehicle tax credit, which was part of the IRA through
Hmm.
Biden. And so, as part of the One Big Beautiful Bill negotiations in Congress, there's a lot of discussion about potential changes that were going to happen with all those different tax credits and incentives. And so, we advocated very strongly that the 40U tax credit specifically was really important for businesses, right, as a way for small businesses and large businesses to save money and reduce emissions at the same time, and just help EV adoption, right, which should be good for everybody. Had a lot of good meetings, met with a ton of people both in the House and the Senate, all up and down Capitol Hill over many months. Unfortunately, as we all know, we lost that battle, and along with the consumer vehicle tax credit and many other incentives from the IRA, did go away. And 40W specifically was at the end of September last year that was taken away. Um, so that was a major kind of frustration and disappointment for us. And I think the part of the impact has also been that has just really been another reason for people in the fleet industry to feel skeptical and hesitant about EVs, right? Because
Hmm.
they're seeing all this kind of policy whiplash happening,
Hmm.
right? At the federal level, especially. So that just sort of a general perception that the Trump administration has done a lot of things to basically like kill EV adoption, kill infrastructure funding, for EV charging, et cetera, which is not really the case. But again, there's kind of a perception that has come about, I think, for a lot of people. Um, and it was unfortunate, right? Because basically 45W, which is really a business incentive, right? Like it wasn't for consumers at all. Just got lumped in as part of this kind of like politically charged environmentalist policy, being sort of like a business policy, right? So you just really unfortunate the way that played out. So I guess the impact of losing for you has been that there may have been. I think there are some deals that we see where the loss of that 45W tax credit, maybe makes some EVs less cost effective than they were before, right? As an alternative, but it really didn't change the fundamental economics, which is that for a very large number of fleet use cases today, fleets will save money on a total cost of ownership basis with EVs over time, right? And so
Hmm.
that kind of fundamental economics hasn't changed. And as we continue to see costs come down over time for EVs, we're going to just see more and more fleet use cases that become that are in the money, basically. And also want to remind people that even though there's been a lot of changes at the federal level in policy and incentives, in many cases that has actually bolstered at the state level, at the utility level, the offer of different, EV and charging related incentives, right? So, don't let kind of the Trump administration's, kind of changes make you think that the whole industry has completely, died. And I guess it's
Yeah.
right. There's still a ton of incentives at other levels of government, other organizations that are providing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
You make a good
the other thing I was going to mention is another thing that I think we need to keep our eyes on is electricity affordability, right?
mm,
And making sure because, for EV adoption and for electrification in general in the economy, right? We need affordable electricity. That's a big political topic now and it is getting some
mhm.
attention, but I think it is important to tie that back to EVs as well and make sure that people know, especially here in California where I am, some of the utility rate increases recently just kind of are shrinking that fuel cost advantage that EVs have, right? More and more. So that's something that we need to keep our eyes on. And then we're also something that we've heard a lot more about recently, actually, in the last few months, is that because this administration and the industry in general is really excited about autonomous vehicles,
Mm,
that because almost all autonomous vehicles today are electric and in the future
mhm.
that will continue to be true, there's a lot of policy and regulatory work happening and interest in AVs. And that I think can be kind of a backdoor way for the industry to kind of push for helpful policy that will work for EVs as well. So that's something we're trying to kind of get that message out there as well.
Yeah, I think you made a very good point. While the commercial vehicle tax or incentive went away, the TCO does not change. That still remains the same because, and really, operators are going to be looking at it from that standpoint too. Yeah, the tax credit would be an offset of in terms of the acquisition of the vehicle, but over the life cycle of the vehicle, your TCO is not diminished. You maybe spent a little more money or didn't get that rebate, but your total cost of ownership still stands. And I think that's an important call out, as well as some of the other points that you've made. An outsider looking into this space would only be able to cite probably the clickbait aspects of the news to really have an opinion about EV and EV charging and the EV industry as a whole. And it might be a little negative, but at the same time, it's not reality once you're inside of it and really looking at the economics of it and how it's coming together. And like you say, even the present administration is looking favorably towards AV. And to your point, AV is pretty much always going to be electric. So, it's not doom and gloom. It's pivots. It's not the end of things. It's transition. And I I have appreciated the public funding opportunities that have come into the market. I've appreciated those tax credits, but I've always been of the opinion that the market itself will always decide whether subsidies are in place or they're not. And so folks are going to move in a direction that's right for them. I remember some of the early chargers that I sold, before 2020, and how there was funding available through Volkswagen back then. And there was some that was like, we're not going to mess with it. It's not worth our time to invest in it and apply for it and either get it or not get it. We have the money and we're going to do it, or we don't have the money and we're not going to do it. And I think that that's probably the right framing. Hey, funding and credits and tax rebates and all that. Hey, we love all that, but it's not been an impediment as those have come in and gone out. And I think that's what we'll continue to see is an ebb and flow of subsidies as it is. Fleet electrification. I want to talk about capital stack and risk allocation as it relates to fleet electrification. That obviously requires someone to absorb risk. And to your point about affordable energy, that's the fuel source. And so affordable energy, I don't know what you guys are paying on average per kilowatt out there at charging stations in California. It's fairly affordable here. But again, that volatility is a factor. And so someone's got to absorb that risk. And then, of course, the utilization uncertainty. I imagine utilization is a topic that you have on the regular when you're talking to fleet operators about utilization. So throughout all of that, you've got to navigate through that. So how does Inspiration Mobility structure the deals so that risk is allocated intentionally rather than it's that gotcha? It's that, oh, we didn't think about. You're thinking about that and you're helping your customers think about that. So what's that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. As a finance company or you kind of a finance oriented company, you can imagine we think a lot about risk and how to allocate it properly, right? And how to share it between the different parties.
Mm,
I'll talk about the vehicle side and the charging side. So on the vehicle side of our business, when we lease vehicles to our customers, we give fleets usually different options when it comes to how much risk they want to take, especially on the residual value of the vehicle as part of that leasing structure, right? We have different options when it comes to, basically, do they take the risk on the residual value at the end of the lease period, or do we, right, as the finance company? So basically, they have different accounting systems and preferences, different financial situations, different balance sheet situations, and so different fleets have very different preferences on how they want to treat a lease, basically, right, and how much risk they're willing to take on residual value. So we do like to, give some options there. And just depending on the fleet, they'll do what's best for them. On the charging side of our business, yeah, we certainly are not in the business of doing pure public charging, just to be clear. And so if we're going to, deploy charging infrastructure, there needs to be some utilization and really some contracted revenue, right, associated with that project for us to go and build, significant piece of charging infrastructure. So what we need generally is the fleet operator to make a commitment, right? And in writing that says, okay, we're going to use this many kilowatt hours per month, right? And so that we can underwrite the deal basically and have some sort of certainty there. We certainly don't want that to be punitive, right? And we always work with the customers very closely to make sure that the targets and the commitments that we put in the contract are, realistic for them, right? And they feel comfortable with that. And certainly there are cases, right, where upfront we had a certain expectation, and then as we get a year into the deal, things have changed, circumstances have changed, and so we are also willing to kind of, be flexible and renegotiate things to kind of make it a win-win for both parties. So certainly that's really important to us, is to make sure, again, that we're making this a good experience for our customers, right? We're not trying to just make as much money as we possibly can and not provide any benefit, right? We want to make sure that the customer's getting the benefit from their EVs, and that it's not kind of something that's hanging over their head.
Mm.
And so basically, as long as we get sort of a commitment from the customer in terms of they're going to adopt so many EVs and use this much energy on an ongoing basis, basically we will, take basically all the risk when it comes to actually deploying that infrastructure, right? And like developing it, planning it, engineering, building it, operating and maintaining it, all those things, right? Like we kind of take on all those pieces, right, for fleet customers that are not energy charging infrastructure experts, right?
In the technology vein, and as it relates to where you sit from an operational edge, AI is a buzzword. There's a lot of aspirations around how AI integrates into our space, how it's leveraged from a utilization standpoint, from a predictive maintenance standpoint. There's all these ways that AI can help us, but I would like to know kind of where Inspiration Mobility sits in that. First, I'd like maybe your opinion on where you think AI is actually creating some measurable leverage as it relates to charging, and then is Inspiration Mobility leveraging it, and maybe how? Whatever you can share. Obviously not secrets, but a secret sauce, but yeah, share what you can.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I think really quick at a high level, the fleet industry as a whole is adopting AI, different fleets at different paces, right? But they are adopting it. The industry is adopting AI and seeing it as a super important tool in the toolkit, right, to help optimize fleet management in the future. So we see that trend kind of across the board. A lot of people are talking about it. When it comes to Inspiration specifically, we have spent a lot of time in our kind of in-house software development team, has spent a lot of time building a kind of a ground up tech stack that is really AI enabled and has kind of AI built in everywhere, right? Is to kind of enable a lot of different AI native tools and capabilities. So we're spending a lot of time on that. Like we have our own in-house fleet management platform that we call Garage. That has just got a ton of really cool AI enabled features built in today, and that's only going to increase in the future. That's kind of in general some of the things we're doing with AI as a company. When it comes to the charging part of Inspiration's business specifically, just to get a little bit more granular there, I did recently write about this in a blog post, which certainly people can find online, about the intersection of AI and charging. And the most immediate and measurable benefit that we see so far from AI is really diagnosing and troubleshooting chargers, hardware failures, that kind of stuff. Just as one specific example, we had one of our DC fast chargers at one of our sites in recent months that had repeated failures of a single part over a few months. And we basically threw all the context about, error code patterns, whatever field maintenance work was done on the charger over that time, kind of threw that all into the AI tool and got some really useful feedback, basically, and guidance with all that context about what are some potential root causes for this particular part failing repeatedly, how to test for and kind of identify, like isolate which root cause is actually the one that's causing it. And even like a prioritized sequence of troubleshooting steps that we could go through to, like, if it's this problem versus that problem. And so that's been really helpful for us, right? And that's really accelerated our ability to kind of isolate problems, get them fixed faster. We can give the charging hardware vendor who's, looking at the logs on, with us, we can give them a lot more context so that they can speed up their diagnosis. And we can also give much better guidance, more specific guidance to the field technician, right, that goes out to actually fix a charger. And obviously, field advantage, I'm sure you guys are doing some of that as well on your side, right? Kind of it's just, there's so much potential there, I think, for leveraging automation through AI to really just make it so much easier and faster, right, for us to fix charger problems. And I guess the bigger impact of that we see is that today we have the team that we have managing chargers that are sites, and we see that with these AI tools, we'll be able to scale up our business, manage more chargers without growing our headcount very much, right? It's just going to be a lot more efficient. And therefore, like, the operating cost per charger per site is going to just go down over time, which is just a good thing for the industry, right? We can lower the OpEx of charging. That's only more affordable for fleets and everybody else to use EV charging. We do a couple other things, just use AI for automating reporting, doing better analytics on the performance of our chargers. We're seeing some partners that are doing, like, optimizing load profiles for charging to reduce utility costs, those sorts of things. And and yeah, really our internal kind of software development team, has been reinventing itself and kind of rearranging its internal processes and roles because of the impact of AI, really, and taking it very seriously. So we're spending a lot of time on it internally as a company, figuring out how do we leverage this amazing new tool and set of capabilities.
Yeah, certainly. There, to your point of not increasing your headcount but using the technology and the resources of AI. I know pretty much at Field Advantage, pretty much everybody has an executive assistant now, and that is an AI. So that's been helpful in kind of streamlining certain tasks and certain things that are monotonous or routine. That can just be exponentially increased through that digital executive assistant there. As I was thinking about your, customer base and the suite of solutions that you bring to those fleet operators, one of the things that I was thinking of is whenever I was a fleet manager and we had converted to compressed natural gas, we, of course, brought on-site fueling, on-site CNG fueling, but it was time filled. And so there would be a need when vehicles, even though they arrived and parked every night, there was a time when they would go out beyond their normal route profiles. And we needed to leverage kind of commercial CNG to be able to make sure they could get back home. And so that created a need for partnership because some of these CNG stations, especially way back then, they were few and far between, but we had to find them. And then we had to kind of create a partnership with them in order to get access in and kind of go through whatever their transaction process is. And then they had to be able to bill us. We had to be able to pay at that site. And so I imagine that, through the creation of some of your sites, whether it's one's you're operating or one you're helping your customers operate, there's got to be roaming partnerships that kind of expand the sandbox for them as a fleet operator, but maybe even offer an opportunity for them to net revenue by allowing others into their fueling environments. And so how is Inspiration Mobility structuring roaming partnerships, or if you're doing that, and what's the site economics look like around that?
Yeah. So roaming partnerships really helpful and important, for the industry as a whole and for us specifically. So I'll say on one side, in terms of when we have fleet customers that are doing public charging, we have, an app basically that we, provide to them that makes it easy for them to kind of like access many of the different public charging networks with a single app. Kind of simplify that interface and make, kind of tracking payments and all that stuff easier. So on that side, we have a solution that helps with public charging for our fleet customers that are going out in the public domain. For the DC fast charging sites that we own and operate ourselves, which we call our Power Up Point sites, is the brand name that we use, even though they're owned by Inspiration. For our Power Up Point sites, the business model there is we've got kind of an anchor fleet customer, which is a great customer of ours, Z-Trip, which is the largest taxi fleet operator in the country. So we've got some sites we built for them. where they're the kind of anchor tenant, if you will. But
Mhm.
we've got other fleets that are sharing the same site coming in, and then those sites are also open to the public, to general public,
Mhm.
which we did, last year. We opened those sites to the public as well, and that's great. And in order to open to those other fleets and to the public, one of the ways that we have done that, and the main way we've done that is through roaming partnerships, right? So we've done integrations between our charging management system backend and some of the other, apps that are out there, to allow fleets to make it easier for them to access our site, right? And so that brings incremental demand, right, to our sites, which is good, from a revenue perspective. Obviously, makes the sites more profitable, and we really see that as, because we're not trying to build a consumer brand necessarily, right? We're really a
Mhm.
fleet focused company, right? So we don't necessarily care as much if they're using somebody else's app. If it's a public, just a normal public driver, right, that's using somebody else's app to start a charging session and pay for charging in our site, that's not really a problem for us, right? What we care about is that we're getting incremental revenue and just
Mhm.
opening out as many different channels and making it as easy as possible for as many drivers to find our site as possible. And so we've got multiple roaming partnerships and backend integrations already. We've got more kind of on the roadmap in the pipeline that we're working on as well. For us, that's something that we see is going to continue to be an important way for us to kind of increase utilization of our sites, for the foreseeable future.
It's good. Want to kind of zoom out and talk about the market kind of as a whole. We've obviously over the last few years seen companies overextending, cash burn, ships crashing. We've seen that. And so I imagine there's been some intention around structural decisions at Inspiration Mobility and how you move in the market. What just your comments as an industry expert, as someone that's been in the space for a time, what structural decisions separate durable charging platforms and solutions from the ones that are built kind of on grow, go, break things, move fast, build the plane as you're flying, and really just some stable long term, growth and benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. So in this a pretty volatile market, I would say Inspiration is doing well, and I'm very proud to be able to say that, because it's not every company in this space right now can say that.
Right.
And yeah, we are constantly evolving and finding new ways to serve customers, right? Kind of new niches, et cetera. So it's not like we've got everything or we had everything figured out on day one. But what I think we have been fairly disciplined and careful, I would say, especially compared to some of the other folks in this space. As a company, we were founded right at the beginning of 2021. So just about 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago, which was like the peak of the SPAC hype cycle around EVs and EV charging, right?
Mm-hmm.
So companies were raising millions or in some cases billions of dollars, pretty easily. And a lot of investors were trying to get in there and make a quick buck in that kind of hype cycle. What we did was we raised money and got commitments from some very serious, stable private equity firms in the infrastructure space that saw this as a long-term trend in terms of fleet electrification, and we're not just looking to make a quick, get in for a year or two and then get out.
Mm-hmm.
That is really like this is a big market that they want to play in. So that I think that was part of our strategy, right? Was having the right investors that had the right kind of mindset and right approach to the market. Like I said, we've been pretty disciplined and pretty careful about hiring and expansion plans. We've, not grown ahead of our actual revenue or having visibility on real revenue to pay for the business and the people that we have. And actually an eye on being cash flow positive since pretty early on in the company. So that's been super important. I think just that financial discipline. And it's been really gratifying to see that we have not, we didn't do what a lot of companies did, which was get a bunch of SPAC funding and then grow their team super fast, right? Get to hundreds of people, very quickly on the team, and then have to lay, most of them off, a couple of years later when, the market kind of materialized more slowly than everybody expected. So it's really, really easy to do that when times are good. And now as the market has slowed down a little bit, we feel like, it's really showing those who have been more disciplined, I think, are standing out more. And I'm proud to say that, we're in a strong financial position as a company today that allows us to control our own destiny, while so many others in the space have, had to shut down, get acquired, or drastically reduce headcount just to stay alive. And many of those companies now are coming to us, right? And so I think we feel very fortunate and very proud of that.
Yeah.
And I think we've been able to adapt quickly as well. Like we talked about 45W tax credit, disappearing last year. And so we had to, adapt to that pretty quickly in terms of how we were structuring our deals, right? Like how we were selling
Mhm.
customers, et cetera, et cetera. So, there's been plenty of adaptation along with that discipline and careful planning. And the other thing I'll say is that, we really believe that we're establishing ourselves as a reliable, credible, long-term player in this industry, right? That is, is now become known as the partner for fleets that are serious about electrifying. So if you want to electrify your fleet, you come to Inspiration. And I think that's been earned, having been in the market now for several years and just, being kind of a steady presence, right? And not being a flash in the pan. And
Mhm.
we're ready to, support and work with customers and a lot of our large corporate fleet customers, right? We're talking about a 10, 15, 10, 5 or 10, maybe more year process for them to transition their fleet to EVs, right? So
Mhm.
want to be that long-term partner that goes from beginning to end, from initial planning of that small pilot, to start all the way through, 100% or as close to 100% as possible of their fleet being EVs.
Yeah. Well, Dan, this has been a great conversation, insightful, and appreciate you sharing your thoughts. I like your kind of forecasting around, over the next few years, if we were to fast forward, just kind of what do you think are the next binding constraints that we need to navigate through? What are the barriers? What are the hills to climb for this all to continue in, like you say, not being a flash in the pan, but a long term? What are the gates we need to get through to get to that longevity?
Yeah. So when I think about on the kind of EV charging side specifically for fleets, really what's holding the market back is the fact that, fleets are not adopting EVs as fast as I would say, we all probably wanted them to be. When I joined Inspiration almost 5 years ago now, we had, certain expectations about where the market was going to be in 2026, right?
Mhm.
And we're not there. And so that kind of like slower adoption has meant less willingness to, sign contracts to, build charging infrastructure, right? As an example. And if some of those, if the adoption sped up, I think that would mean that a lot of the companies that are in the space focused on fleet charging would be expanding and doing great right now instead of, consolidating or exiting the market. What that means is that the kind of the main bottleneck is really fleet strategy, the kind of fleet focus on EV adoption. Right? And we
Mhm.
know there are a lot of different barriers around EV adoption, right? There's charging project costs and timelines. There's upfront cost of the vehicles. There's having the right EV models available to fit, specific fleet use cases. There's the complexity of managing electricity costs and many others. And it really takes the right partner and team to help customers figure out where EVs make the most sense, right? And again, that's like a big part of what we do, right? It's just that kind of upfront planning process, right? It's the adoption strategy. And our goal is really just to make that adoption process as smooth and easy as possible. But I really think that what it comes down to ultimately behind all those barriers, there's really the barrier, which is human inertia.
Mm.
Fleet operators are sometimes with, I think, reasonable thoughts behind it, afraid, skeptical of EVs about this different paradigm, which, you've talked about on previous episodes, totally different paradigm of both fueling and operating the vehicles, right, with EVs.
Mhm.
And or maybe they're frustrated about, feeling like they're being forced into EVs by regulatory mandates, right, that we've had in California, for instance. So in my mind, the goal is really how do we overcome that human inertia by making EVs irresistible for, right? And we've got still plenty of work to do and kind of knocking down all the barriers and also having kind of successful case studies and examples to point to, right? For every different segment of the fleet market, right? I think we've got a lot of good examples today, especially for light duty passenger vehicles. And most of those are looking pretty good from a, economics perspective and a use case perspective with EVs.
Mm.
More work to do, certainly on the medium and heavy duty side of the market in those vehicle classes, right? To really point to like great examples of like the fleets that were successful, right, with EV deployments. But those are coming, right? They do exist and they're going to become more common. But yeah, we still got some work to do there. But I think like I said, the constraint is ultimately human resistance to change is a difficult thing to overcome, and it just takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of different players in the market kind of working together to educate and, like I said, to show these successful case studies that will overcome the skepticism.
Well, Dan, as we get ready to close out this conversation. I'd like you to share any final thoughts, being shots of wisdom, and then also for the audience, I'd like you to share your contact information and how folks can get in contact with you to reach you directly to find out more about what you're doing in the space, what Inspiration Mobility is doing. If you could do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, just wrapping up what we're thinking about and what Inspiration is thinking about is the fact that although the EV market in the US is growing more slowly than some of us would like, and has slowed down a little bit again under the current administration, policy headwinds, et cetera, the deployment is growing globally. Fleets globally are adopting EVs, right, in increasing numbers. And it is growing in the US too, right? Just more slowly than we were hoping. So the long-term trend toward electric mobility generally, right, is very clear. And we have absolutely no doubt about the fact that the end result is going to be that most transportation in the future will be electric, if not all. And so the only question is now, how quickly we will get there in the United States versus other parts of the world. So even though we are not at the peak of the hype cycle right now for EVs like we were a few years ago, we still think that this is a super exciting industry to be in. I wake up every day, excited and eager to tackle the problems around fleet electrification. I think it's just a really rewarding and fun place to be, and working with interesting people like yourself in this industry to tackle these problems. And then the other piece of it, I think, is that both electric vehicle and charging technology is maturing rapidly. I think it really is at the point where it's ready for mainstream adoption. Companies like Inspiration are despite maybe a lot of people moved on to hype about AI or other technologies or focusing on data centers, et cetera. Companies like Inspiration, we're going to stay focused on this problem because it's really important for the future of our planet. And also because it's not just a sustainability strategy, but it's also an economic and operational improvement, right, that fleets will see with electrification as well as something that, again, is just necessary for us to have the future that we want for our kids. And then, let me talk about my contact information. So reach me by email, just dwilson@inspirationmobility.com. If you want to email me, I'm happy to respond that way. Our company website is inspirationmobility.com. And then, of course, LinkedIn is a great way to contact me, and I'm just Dan Wilson on LinkedIn. And then Inspiration Mobility, obviously you can find Inspiration Mobility on LinkedIn as well. And that's a great way to do that. And yeah, would love to hear from anybody that's interested in working with us on electrifying fleets or partnering with us to deliver solutions for electric fleets as well.
Dan, thanks for coming on Field Frequency.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it, Jason, and keep up the good work here.
This episode was produced and edited by the team at Autozy. To find out more, visit autozy.co, AUTOZY.co.